Спасибо за приглашение на второй международный фестиваль антибуржуазной антикультуры в Восточной Европе. К сожалению, я представляю мой адрес по-английски. Я верю, что у вас есть перевод. So the title of my talk today is Herbert Marcuse on the Negativity of the Dialectic, or the Dark Side of Capital, Radical Struggle Against Genocide and Ecocide. In a reflection of history, Herbert Marcuse's radical dialectical thought varied in its overall mood, that is, its assessment of the chance for a resurgent, emancipatory global revolution against capitalism and authority. In One-Dimensional Man, 1964, Marcuse's most famous work, the critical theorist presents a pessimistic analysis due to the supposed cultural and psychological integration of the masses into U.S. monopoly capitalist society, declaring in the closing lines of this book that the possibility of revolution remains, quote, nothing but a chance, end quote. Yet shortly after One-Dimensional Man was published, Marcuse's focus shifted to a profound militancy, as seen especially in Repressive Tolerance, 1965, the philosopher's analysis of Gracchus Babeuf and the Conspiracy of Equals, 1967, and the Essay on Liberation, 1969. As a transnational prophet of revolution, Marcuse embraced the global upsurge of 1968, and in many ways he both influenced and inspired it, and was held responsible for it by numerous state authorities. In fact, Marcuse was present at the beginning of the May 1968 uprising in Paris. Nevertheless, this world historical insurgent wave failed to overthrow global capitalism, and we all suffer the consequences for it. Indeed, considering the span of Marcuse's thought, one cannot deny the movingly plaintive mood of much of his work. From the beginning of his public career, which was overshadowed by the rise of Nazism, to the prescient warnings he made about the direction of capitalism and authority at life's end in the late 1970s. Clear affinities exist here between Marcuse and his comrade Walter Benjamin, who was martyred shortly after Hitler's armies occupied Paris in 1940. In parallel to the undeniable negativity of our own present reality, in light of the Trump regime, the power of imperialism, and the accelerating Sixth Mass Extinction, in this presentation I will concentrate on 4 essays by Marcuse on art and ecology, 1 from his early years and 3 toward the end of his life, and then assess the ongoing struggle against genocide and global ecocide, concluding with some reflections and recommendations inspired by Marcuse. So the first of these essays is The Affirmative Character of Art, from around 1935. In this essay, Marcuse essentially argues that bourgeois culture and art seek to affirm the existing society. This is its connection with philosophical positivism. It is a well-known liberal bourgeois fantasy that is propagated in the United States as the American dream. The idea that progress is possible, as Marcuse puts it, quote, without any transformation of the state of fact, end quote. Given that this essay was written in the 1930s while Marcuse was in exile from his native Germany due to the rise of Nazism, clearly he is concerned in trying to understand how it is that Nazism came about. And part of his argument in this essay is that bourgeois society and culture in particular facilitated the rise of Nazism. And so actually this goes back to Marcuse's point about a point that recurs throughout his oeuvre, that there is a conflict between positivism and an anticipation of a more liberated future actually in bourgeois art, which again has a parallel to the stunted historical development that saw bourgeois society in its overthrow of feudalism and monarchy being tied to philosophical positivism, being a conservative movement seeking to uphold bourgeois domination of society, versus the emancipatory potential of German idealism. According to Marcuse, affirmative bourgeois art serves an important historical function in disciplining society by resigning it to what exists rather than what could be. So in this essay, Marcuse argues that beauty serves an anesthetic function. As he writes, quote, "The beauty of art is compatible with the bad present." Also, quote, "By exhibiting the beautiful as present, art pacifies rebellious desire." End quote. So in contrast to his views regarding art throughout much of the rest of his life, Marcuse, in this analysis on the informative character of bourgeois art, believes that art effectively serves to legitimize capitalism and war. Thus, in this essay, art lacks the dialectically subversive and romantic character Marcuse identifies in other works such as The Aesthetic Dimension from 1978. Even beauty itself is complicit with authoritarianism and genocide, according to Marcuse, because it does not contradict these realities. That is the meaning of its compatibility with the bad present. Moving to the second essay, Lyric Poetry After Auschwitz, from 1978. In a similar vein, this essay by Marcuse is a response to his comrade Theodor W. Adorno's assertion that, quote, "to write poetry after Auschwitz is barbaric," end quote. Marcuse sympathizes with Adorno's view, but ultimately disagrees. He argues that poetry and art can still be made after the Holocaust or the Shoah, but that poetry and art must give voice to, quote, "the horror that was and still is," end quote. At a minimum, art and literature must recall the cry, quote, "despair and resistance," end quote, of the victims of the Shoah and other genocides. Art, therefore, comes to legitimize itself by, quote, "preserving and developing the memory of those who did not have a chance," end quote, as well as the, quote, "many millions who still have no chance," end quote. Artists and their audiences alike are all responsible for commemorating the victims of war and genocide, and also for recognizing as well as agitating against ongoing genocide, which is, quote, "still happening in many areas of the globe," end quote. Of course, no historical law exists to guard against the recurrence of genocide, and Marcuse recognized the clear capitalist tendency toward ever greater militarism and destruction. He believes that art must depict both the reality of totalitarianism as well as resistance to it. Now to the third work, which is actually an address, The Children of Prometheus from 1979. So supervised, managed, and administered by the children of Prometheus, that is the followers of Prometheus, who we can think, a prime example being Donald Trump, capitalism functions on the basis of productive destruction, Marcuse argues, as is reflected in systemic environmental pollution and the development of nuclear energy. Marcuse in this address also condemns all modes of inwardness which do not, quote, "hold tightly," end quote, to remembering the Shoah, or that somehow disavow it as inconsequential. And he claims that any concept of historical progress is false if it does not consider a repetition of the Shoah to be possible. Now moving to the fourth and last essay, which again is another address. This is Ecology and the Critique of Modern Society. And to briefly introduce some of the concepts here, they do have to do with social psychology or meta-psychology, indeed with Freudian psychology. And of course, Marcuse was very taken by Freud, especially after 1955 with his work Eros and Civilization. And so in this address, in this intervention, Marcuse discusses the Freudian categories of Eros and Thanatos. Eros being the life drive, and Thanatos being the death drive or the death compulsion. So Marcuse in this address, which was given before a wilderness society in California, associates the destruction of nature with the power of Thanatos, and the defensive nature with eros. Continuing in this psychological or metapsychological fashion, Marcuse argues that the destruction of, quote, other living beings and nature, end quote, to be an externalization of this very strength of Thanatos, which in this way, by destroying life, by destroying nature, helps to avert its own suicide, which is compelled by the power of Thanatos or death. Marcuse also distinguishes here between the affirmative character structure, which is Thanatos dominant, and the radical character structure, which is Eros dominant. Similarly, he distinguishes between compensatory needs and emancipatory needs. The difference between these being that compensatory needs refers to those needs that affirm the existing reality, whereas the emancipatory needs that demand the transformation of existing reality. Actually, in this struggle or equilibrium between these two forces, Marcuse, reflecting the legacy of the 1960s and 70s, here hopefully states that actually emancipatory needs, quote, permeate the lives of individuals, end quote. He associates ecology with the protection and enhancement of life, and calls on resistance to take on the form of, quote, existential revolts, a revolt in which the whole organism, the very soul of the human being, becomes political, a revolt of the life instincts against organized and socialized destruction. Marcuse, in this address, in parallel to Adorno, defines the human goal of revolution as the emergence of humans who are, quote, physically and mentally incapable, end quote, of allowing for a recurrence of Auschwitz. Now, that's the first half of my comments today. Now I will turn to assessing some of the points that Marcuse makes and that I have brought to your attention today. So, how is this struggle going of creating humans who are incapable of allowing for genocide to recur? Well, if we judge the present using these criteria of Adorno and Marcuse, then clearly history is a failure. Genocide is still very much ongoing, as unfortunately can be expected given that capitalism and authority persist. Affirmative art and culture remain dominant, presenting the various ills of bourgeois society in a reified manner. When they are considered at all, war, fascism, and ecological self-destruction are considered either to be natural or to represent necessary evils for the perpetuation of capital. Therefore, in what remains of my comments, I wish to examine some of these ongoing genocides, the climate crisis, and the Sixth Mass Extinction. My approach here is close to Ocean Neumann in his 2011 address, Who's Winning, Eros or Thanatos? So first of all, we must mention and analyze the Trump regime. Before Trump became the US president, the threat of nuclear war was already high. Now, it is worse. Trump has reportedly envisioned increasing the US nuclear stockpile by a factor of 10, with this being the reason that the Secretary of State, Rex Tillerson, ostensibly called him a fucking moron, quite correctly. And Trump has expressed confusion over why the US should have a nuclear stockpile if the military doesn't actively use it. He has also called for the redeployment of tactical nuclear weapons in warfare. So, both reflecting Trump, but also the larger systemic issues that compel the threat of nuclear war, the doomsday clock, which is managed by the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists for many years, going back to the beginnings of the Cold War, they more or less every year come up with an assessment of how humanity is doing in terms of these threats to its very life and survival. And so this doomsday clock, being symbolic, depicts a 12-hour or 24-hour cycle in which the 12 o'clock midnight represents apocalypse or destruction. Right now, the scientists have estimated that we are at 11:57 with 30 seconds. That is to say, 2 minutes and 30 seconds to go. It's probably more like 11:59. Why? With the power of the Trump regime compared and juxtaposed with the possibility of war, including nuclear war, with either North Korea and or Iran, makes this risk much higher probably than the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists wants to recognize. We see with regard to North Korea that Trump has undermined Rex Tillerson again by suggesting that talks are not on the table and that instead fire and fury is the rules the day. With regard to Iran, we see that the US and Israel are actually becoming very close with Saudi Arabia. Of course, the US has for a long time been very close to the Wahhabist extremists who rule over Saudi Arabia. But now we see the interesting development that Israel and Saudi Arabia are coming together, with an official from Israel, in fact, inviting Mohammed bin Salman on an official visit to the country. This, together with the United Arab Emirates and other reactionary Gulf kingdoms, we see a very clear axis, really, against Iran in the Middle East, among the Sunni emirates and kingdoms, together with Israel and, of course, Trump behind the scenes, or not even behind the scenes. And so we see Trump desiring to decertify the Iran nuclear deal on a simple pretext that has no reflection with reality. And in a way, we see a parallel to George W. Bush's fabrications about intelligence linking Saddam Hussein with Al-Qaeda, or saying that Saddam Hussein had well, not nuclear, but chemical weapons stockpile that could be used by terrorists. This argument being used to justify, rationalize the invasion and destruction of Iraq. Whereas we see a similar idea here with Iran, the difference being that a war with Iran would be much more devastating than with Iraq, and could even lead to a nuclear war. And we know from various studies, scientifically speaking, that even a limited nuclear war could induce a nuclear winter across the globe, destroying much of humanity and nature. In fact, as a reflection of this rivalry that we see between the US, Israel, and the reactionary Sunni monarchies in the Middle East versus Iran, we see the outcomes in Yemen currently, which is suffering what could very well be considered a genocide at the hands of Saudi Arabia, due to their opposition to the idea of having the Houthi rebels take power in that country, given that the Houthis are supposedly backed by Iran. The outcome is that we see currently that 8 million people are at immediate risk of famine in Yemen, and that cholera, malaria, diphtheria, and various other acute diseases are rampant. Similarly, in Burma and Bangladesh, we have the ongoing Rohingya genocide. Since August of this year, we see more than 600,000 refugees fleeing from Burma, also known as Myanmar, due to the scorched earth tactics carried out by the Burmese military against the Rohingya, mostly Muslim minority. In fact, a very recent report by MSF, Médecins Sans Frontières, estimates that nearly 7,000 Rohingya were murdered in the first month of this most recent campaign of ethnic cleansing. This genocidal campaign is mostly driven by ethnic nationalism as well as the interests of capitalist extractivism. We see that Burma is being supported with military deals, that is, for weapons, with Russia, China, Israel, and former Yugoslavian countries. Of course, probably the United States would be on that list. The only problem is that there's a sanctions regime, not a ban. There's limited trade with Burma because of the historical dictatorship there, which very much persists, even though there's a facade of parliamentarism now with Aung San Suu Kyi. Going back to the Middle East, in Palestine, we see the ethnic cleansing very clearly accelerating there, particularly after Trump's recognition of Jerusalem as the Israeli capital. Now, this idea, which more or less crushes the possibility of a two-state solution between Israel and Palestine, raises the possibility of Israel directly annexing the settlements that are in place in the West Bank and East Jerusalem, with the remaining Palestinian territories, on the other hand, annexed by Jordan. What is to be made of Gaza? In Syria, we see that following a long and genocidal counterinsurgent war, in which Assad was aided by parties such as Russia, Iran, Hezbollah, Liwa Fatemiyun, and other Shia militias, using tactics and strategies marked by starvation sieges, the extermination of political prisoners, and the indiscriminate destruction of civilian areas, we see the Ba'athist state headed by Bashar al-Assad to have won the war and crushed the revolution. In terms of the Kurds, who very clearly suffered threat of genocide along with the Yazidis from the emergence of Daesh, or the Islamic State, we have seen a very heroic defense movement against these reactionary, essentially fascist militias reflected in Daesh. We see that the resistance of the Kurds, and particularly in Syria, though, or otherwise known as Rojava, has been made complicated by their alliance with the US and Russia in terms of having military support against Daesh. In neighboring Iraq, in the region known as Bashur, the recent referendum for independence from Iraq caused a vast mobilization of the regional states, that is, the Turkish, Iraqi, and Iranian states, against the Kurdish minorities of those countries, respectively, with this indicating a great setback for the Kurds' happiness and livelihood. In terms of ecology, in 2014, the World Wildlife Fund reported that Earth had lost 50% of its vertebrates since the 1970s as a result of habitat loss, exploitation, and global warming. Moreover, scientists are increasingly coming to recognize that we are now in the midst of a sixth mass extinction of life on Earth due to the activities of humanity, or more specifically, capitalism. And so, for this reason, a group of Earth scientists have recommended that the current geological age be renamed the Anthropocene to reflect humanity's degradation of the environment, whereas more reasonable and radical observers correctly suggest that it should instead be called the Capitalocene. In terms of climate change and global warming, we see that carbon emissions continue to break annual records, that emissions are continuing to grow at the rate of 2 to 3%, whereas what climatologists have told us very clearly is that the opposite must be the case. There must be a sweeping reduction in carbon emissions, taken together with the direct removal of excess atmospheric carbon dioxide. Now, this demands a global contraction and convergence of emissions, mostly through the abolition of emissions from overdeveloped capitalist countries. Of course, such goals, which according to the science must be met within the next few years if climate apocalypse is to be averted, are entirely utopian as long as capital persists. Science makes its corrective demands in terms of regenerating the biosphere, but capitalism has its own exigencies, which, based on the maxim of productive destruction, entirely contradict these. Marxism and anarchism, reflecting their Hegelian imprint, both anticipate a liberated future society that is to be born through struggling through the contradictions of bourgeois society. Yet the specters of nuclear war and climate destruction, themselves the pinnacle of bourgeois self-expression, present fundamental challenges to the dialectic of redemption or liberation. Of course, we need an erotic revolt of the, quote, whole organism against organized and socialized destruction, end quote, if we are to avoid such calamitous ends. But the power of Thanatos may be too strong, such that, quote, we may indeed speak of a suicidal tendency on a truly social scale. End quote. Spasiba большое.